In the late summer of 1943, as the war in Europe ground forward with mechanical certainty, the American interior appeared almost untouched by its violence. Wheat fields bent in the wind across the Great Plains. Cattle moved slowly beneath a wide, indifferent sky. Rail lines cut through towns where the rhythm of life remained governed by seasons rather than sirens. Official communiques spoke of battles thousands of miles away, of cities reduced to rubble, of advances and retreats measured in maps and casualties. Yet far from those front lines, another kind of encounter was taking shape, quiet and unrecorded, unfolding in places not meant for history. It began without ceremony. Trains arrived at depots that were never intended to receive prisoners of war. Their cargo was not weapons or machinery but men, thin, weary, disciplined by years of command and collapse. German soldiers, captured in North Africa or Europe, stepped down onto American soil under the gaze of military police and curious civilians. Their uniforms were worn but intact, their posture still marked by training. They were counted, processed, and sent onward, often to regions whose names they could not pronounce and whose vastness unsettled them more than captivity itself. The public narrative was clear and efficient. These men were enemies removed from the battlefield, housed securely, put to work where labor was scarce. Their presence was framed as both necessity and proof of American orderliness. Newspaper articles mentioned them in passing: prisoners harvesting crops, repairing roads, contributing quietly to the war effort under watchful eyes. The tone was practical, almost benign. What went unspoken was the intimacy of proximity, how closely the lives of captor and captive would come to overlap in the most ordinary of ways. In the rural stretches of the Midwest and the Southwest, the war arrived not as explosions but as a change in routine. Farm owners were told to expect additional hands. Ranchers were informed that work crews would be assigned to them, supervised but largely self-sustaining. Some were uneasy. Others were grateful. Few imagined what it would mean to share long days with men who, only months earlier, had worn a different uniform under a different flag. The camps themselves varied in size and permanence. Some were hastily assembled from wood and wire, others adapted from existing facilities. They were meant to be temporary, functional, and invisible. Yet within their boundaries, a strange social world began to form. Roll calls marked the days. Meals were served at fixed hours. There were rules governing speech, movement, conduct. And beyond the fences lay a country that felt unreal to many of the men confined there. Too open, too quiet, too unlike the landscapes of war they had left behind. What unsettled observers most was not the presence of prisoners, but the way life continued around them. American farmers drove their trucks past the camps each morning. Children rode bicycles along roads that bordered wire fences. On Sundays, church bells rang as they always had. The prisoners heard these sounds and learned to distinguish them. The rhythm of American time, measured not by commands or alarms, but by habit and routine. It was within this setting that an unexpected relationship began to take shape. German prisoners were assigned to work details on ranches and farms, often under minimal supervision. They rose before dawn, ate simple meals, and spent long hours in fields or barns alongside American civilians. Language barriers limited conversation, but work itself provided a common grammar. Tools passed from hand to hand. Gestures replaced words. Over time, patterns emerged: shared tasks, shared fatigue, shared silence. To many of the prisoners, this environment was disorienting. They had been taught to expect hostility, deprivation, perhaps brutality. Instead, they encountered a different kind of discipline. One rooted not in fear but in routine, not in ideology but in necessity. They were watched, certainly, but not constantly. They were confined, yet entrusted with responsibility. The contradiction was difficult to reconcile. For the Americans, the experience carried its own unease. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought for a regime that had reshaped the world through violence. And yet, in the daily rhythm of work, that identity became blurred. A man who could mend a fence or calm a restless horse did not fit easily into the abstract image of an enemy. The distance between us and them narrowed in ways that felt both natural and forbidden. The war, as it was understood through headlines and speeches, depended on clarity: allies and enemies, victory and defeat. But on these farms, clarity dissolved into ambiguity. The boundaries that defined loyalty and opposition softened under the pressure of shared labor and human need. No one spoke of ideology in the fields. There was only the weather, the soil, the exhaustion at the end of the day. Yet beneath this quiet cooperation ran an undercurrent of tension. The guards remained guards. The prisoners remained prisoners. The fences were real even when they were distant. Every interaction took place within an unspoken awareness of power and constraint. Kindness did not erase captivity, it merely complicated it. As months passed, the men on both sides began to sense that something unusual was occurring, something that did not fit easily into the language of war. It was not friendship in the ordinary sense, nor was it reconciliation. It was a suspension, a narrow space in which enemy identities softened without disappearing, where ordinary life intruded upon extraordinary circumstances. This was the paradox at the heart of the experience, that in the midst of a global conflict defined by ideology and destruction, a quiet, almost invisible exchange was taking place between individuals who were supposed to remain forever opposed. The fields where this happened bore no monuments. The records were sparse. Yet the impressions left on those who lived through it endured, unsettled and unresolved. What unfolded in these rural corners of America was not a story of triumph or reconciliation, but of proximity, of what happens when war forces enemies to look at one another not across a battlefield, but across a shared day of labor, beneath the same unremarkable sky. The days settled into patterns that felt at once rigid and strangely loose. Reveille came early, marked not by bugles but by the sound of doors opening and boots on packed dirt. The German prisoners rose from their bunks, folded blankets with practiced precision, and lined up for the morning count. The routine was efficient, almost clinical, a continuation of habits learned long before capture. Yet outside the barracks, the world did not resemble the one that had shaped them. The air smelled of cut hay and damp earth rather than smoke or cordite. The horizon stretched wide, uninterrupted by ruins or checkpoints. Even before the day's labor began, the environment itself unsettled expectations. After a brief meal, usually bread, coffee, sometimes eggs, the work details were assigned. Trucks arrived to collect small groups of prisoners and carry them to nearby farms and ranches. Guards accompanied them, but often with a looseness that surprised the men themselves. Rifles were slung, not raised. Conversation was sparse but not forbidden. The prisoners learned the rhythms of the land quickly. When the sun would crest the hills, when the heat would peak, when the wind would rise in the afternoon and bring relief. On the farms, work began without ceremony. Fences needed mending. Fields needed clearing. Livestock needed tending. For many of the prisoners, these tasks were not unfamiliar. Before the war, they had been farmers, laborers, craftsmen. Their hands remembered what their uniforms tried to erase. The physicality of the work, its demands and its simplicity, offered a strange comfort. Muscles burned in familiar ways. Dirt gathered under fingernails. Time passed not in hours but in completed tasks. The American farmers watched them closely at first. There was caution in their movements, an awareness reinforced by years of propaganda and fear. These were enemy soldiers, men whose nation had brought devastation across continents. Yet the reality in front of them did not align neatly with that image. The prisoners spoke little English, but they understood work. They understood when a tool was handed to them, when a gesture indicated what needed to be done. They listened. They learned. They worked steadily, sometimes silently, sometimes with quiet exchanges that skirted language. Gradually, small accommodations emerged. A farmer might offer water without being asked. A prisoner might nod in thanks, his expression carefully neutral. Lunch breaks were taken in the shade of trees or barns. Food was simple: bread, cheese, sometimes meat. The Americans ate apart but within sight. There were rules against sharing meals, against fraternization, yet the proximity made strict separation impractical. Glances were exchanged. Occasionally, a cigarette was offered and accepted without comment. For the prisoners, these moments carried weight far beyond their simplicity. They stood in contrast to the months or years that had come before: marches, orders shouted in anger, the constant presence of fear. Here the authority was quieter, more restrained. The men were still captives, but they were not humiliated. The absence of cruelty unsettled them almost as much as its presence might have. Some felt suspicion, others gratitude, and many a confusion they struggled to articulate even to themselves. At night, back in the camps, conversations unfolded in low voices. Men spoke of the farms, of the strange kindness of certain guards, of the land itself. Some wondered aloud whether this was an illusion, a temporary softness before a harsher turn. Others reflected on the differences between what they had been told to expect and what they were experiencing. Arguments broke out, about loyalty, about dignity, about whether it was dangerous to grow accustomed to such treatment. The camp was a place of waiting but also of thinking, and thought could be as unsettling as any hardship. The guards, too, carried their own contradictions. Many were older men unfit for overseas service, or younger ones awaiting reassignment. Some had never left their home states before being assigned to the camps. For them, the prisoners represented both duty and disruption. They were tasked with enforcing order, yet they found themselves supervising men who, in many ways, mirrored their own lives. Farmers guarded farmers. Workers oversaw workers. The line between them was maintained by uniform and regulation, but beneath it ran a current of uneasy recognition. Occasionally, a guard would speak of home, of a wife or children waiting. A prisoner might respond with a nod, perhaps a brief mention of his own family, far away and unreachable. These exchanges were rarely emotional, but they carried weight precisely because of their restraint. They were acknowledgments of shared humanity made cautiously, as if both sides feared crossing an invisible boundary. The official structure of the camp remained intact. Roll calls were strict. Infractions were punished. Escapes were rare but taken seriously. When rumors circulated of attempted breakouts in other camps, security tightened. The presence of barbed wire and watchtowers was a constant reminder of the imbalance of power. No amount of routine or familiarity erased the fact that one group could leave and the other could not. Yet it was within this framework of control that subtle shifts occurred. Some prisoners began to take pride in their work, not as an act of allegiance, but as a way to assert competence and dignity. They repaired machinery with care, tended animals diligently, and kept tools in good condition. In doing so, they carved out a sense of self that existed independently of their status as captives. For the Americans, this diligence provoked reflection. It complicated the simple narrative of enemy and ally. The men before them were not abstractions but individuals with skills, habits, and quiet determination. This realization did not erase the war or its stakes, but it altered the texture of daily life. The conflict became something lived alongside, rather than something constantly performed. The seasons changed and with them the nature of the work. Harvest brought longer days and heavier labor. Winter slowed everything, confining men to closer quarters. During these colder months, interactions intensified. There was more talking, more observing. Songs were sometimes heard drifting from the barracks at night, German folk tunes sung softly. The guards listened from a distance, unsure how to interpret the sound. It was not defiance nor celebration, but something in between, a reminder of identity that refused to disappear. Letters from home arrived sporadically, censored and delayed. For the prisoners, they were lifelines, carrying news both comforting and devastating. Losses were reported, cities destroyed, families displaced. The knowledge of these events deepened the strangeness of their current existence. While their homeland burned, they labored in relative safety, under the watch of those who had defeated them. The moral weight of this contrast pressed heavily, though rarely spoken aloud. As months passed, the war moved closer to its end. News filtered in through newspapers, guards' conversations, and the occasional radio broadcast. The tone shifted, cautious optimism mixed with uncertainty. For the prisoners, the prospect of liberation did not bring unambiguous relief. Questions loomed: what would they return to? Who would they be in a defeated country? Would the world they remembered still exist? In the fields, work continued much as before. The routines persisted even as their meaning began to change. Tasks once performed simply to fill the day now carried a sense of finality. Each repaired fence, each harvested crop, felt like a closing chapter. The relationships, tentative and unspoken, grew heavier with the knowledge that they were temporary. American farmers sensed this change as well. Some felt relief at the thought of resuming life without the presence of prisoners. Others experienced an unexpected sense of loss. The men who had labored beside them, who had become part of the landscape of their days, would soon be gone. The war that had brought them together was ending, and with it the peculiar, uneasy coexistence they had shared. No ceremonies marked the shift. There were no speeches, no acknowledgments of what had passed between captor and captive. The system moved forward, efficient and impersonal. Orders came. Preparations were made. The camps began to empty. Yet even as the physical structures remained, the barracks, the fences, the worn paths between them, the atmosphere changed. Something intangible receded, leaving behind a sense of absence that was difficult to name. What had occurred in those spaces resisted easy summary. It was not friendship, not reconciliation, not redemption. It was a human encounter shaped by circumstance, constraint, and the quiet persistence of ordinary life amid extraordinary conditions. And as the prisoners prepared to leave, carrying with them memories they would struggle to explain, the land itself seemed indifferent. Fields waited to be plowed again. Fences stood ready for repair. The work would continue as it always had, bearing little trace of the men who had labored there under watchful eyes, suspended between war and its aftermath. The departures did not come all at once. They arrived in increments, measured by lists and schedules, by the slow emptying of barracks that had once held hundreds of men. Trucks came again, this time to carry the prisoners away rather than deliver them. The process was orderly, efficient, and almost silent. There were no ceremonies to mark the moment, no formal goodbyes. Men gathered their few belongings, folded blankets for the last time, and stepped through gates they had passed so often that the act of leaving felt unreal. For those who remained behind, the guards, the farmers, the townspeople, the absence was not immediately felt. Daily routines continued. Livestock still needed tending. Fields still demanded labor. The land, indifferent as ever, accepted new hands without comment. Yet something in the rhythm of life had shifted. The fields seemed wider. The silence between tasks stretched longer. The sense of being observed, of sharing space with those who did not belong yet had become familiar, was gone. In the months that followed, memory began to work in subtle ways. It did not announce itself as history. It appeared instead in small disruptions. A farmer pausing while repairing a fence, momentarily recalling how another pair of hands once held the wire steady. A former guard hearing a foreign accent in a passing traveler and feeling an inexplicable tightening in the chest. These were not moments of nostalgia so much as moments of recognition, of something unfinished, unresolved. For the men who returned to Germany, the transition was harsher. The world they came back to bore little resemblance to the one they had left. Cities lay in ruin, families scattered or lost, familiar streets reduced to debris. In this landscape of collapse, memories of captivity in America took on an unsettling clarity. The farms, the open skies, the predictability of daily labor. These recollections stood in sharp contrast to the chaos of post-war life. Some men found themselves recalling the camps with a sense of disquieting calm, a feeling that sat uneasily alongside guilt and loss. They spoke of it rarely, and when they did, their words were careful. To speak too fondly of captivity felt disloyal, even shameful. To speak too harshly felt dishonest. The truth, whatever it was, resisted simple expression. It existed somewhere between gratitude and humiliation, between relief and regret. The experience had altered them in ways they could not fully articulate, reshaping their understanding of power, obedience, and humanity. In America, the story faded quickly. The war became something remembered through victory parades, monuments, and official histories. The presence of enemy soldiers on American soil was rarely mentioned, and when it was, it appeared as a footnote, a logistical achievement, a footnote to triumph. The complexity of those encounters, the daily negotiations of dignity and authority, found little place in public memory. Yet traces remained, embedded quietly in the lives of those who had witnessed it firsthand. A former guard might recall years later the sound of a German folk song drifting across a field at dusk. A farmer might remember the way a prisoner had repaired a broken gate with care that suggested pride rather than obligation. These memories surfaced without warning, often years later, resisting the simple narratives that history preferred. As time passed, the physical evidence disappeared. Camps were dismantled or repurposed. Roads were paved over former compounds. New buildings rose where watchtowers once stood. Children grew up unaware that men from another continent had once lived and worked in those same places, separated by little more than wire and circumstance. The land absorbed the past without comment, offering no markers to distinguish what had been. Yet memory has a way of persisting in fragments. In the recollections of those who lived through it, the experience remained unresolved. It was not a story of redemption or reconciliation, nor one of cruelty alone. It existed in the spaces between categories, in the quiet recognition of shared labor, in the uneasy coexistence of captor and captive, in the way ordinary life continued under extraordinary conditions. The war, in its vastness, demanded clear divisions: enemy and ally, victor and defeated. But in these fields and camps such divisions blurred. Men who had been taught to see one another as enemies found themselves bound by routine, necessity, and the simple fact of coexisting day after day. The result was not harmony but something more ambiguous, a coexistence marked by restraint, observation, and unspoken understanding. As years turned into decades, those who remembered carried their experiences privately. Few spoke of them openly, and fewer still found listeners who wished to hear such complicated stories. History preferred cleaner lines, clearer lessons. Yet beneath those simplified accounts lay the quieter truth of what had transpired, that in the midst of a global conflict defined by violence and ideology, there existed pockets of human interaction that defied easy categorization. The fields where this occurred now bear no signs of what once took place. Crops grow and are harvested. Roads lead elsewhere. The names of the men who lived and worked there are largely forgotten. But the echoes remain, faint and persistent, in the memories of those who carried them forward and in the silences where their stories were never told. In the end, what endured was not a resolution but a question, one that resists closure. What does it mean to encounter an enemy not on a battlefield, but in the routines of daily life? What remains when conflict gives way to proximity, and ideology yields, however briefly, to shared existence? The answers were never recorded, only lived, and then slowly absorbed into the quiet fabric of memory, where they continue to linger, unresolved and enduring, long after the war itself has passed.